today I want to talk about a little bit of Star Wars history for you. So if you don't know, which I feel like most people should, but just in case, if you don't know, Anakin Skywalker, his character in the Star Wars trilogies, or whatever you want to call it, he is on his quest to be like, I don't want to say on this quest, but he has like this prophecy that he's supposed to be the greatest Jedi ever, and he's supposed to bring balance to the Force. He's supposed to bring balance from good and evil. Okay. Long story short, he goes to the council, and they're having second thoughts. You know, they're using their Jedi mind tricks or whatever. And long story short, Anakin starts, I think he starts talking to, I think her name is Padme or something like that. And she says, or excuse me, he says to her that I have this desire for more, even though I know I shouldn't. You know, I want more, even though I know I shouldn't. Okay, fast forward. Him and Obi-Wan are fighting, duking it out, you know, for reasons. And Obi-Wan, he is, he's talking to Anakin. And I believe it's around the time Anakin's like losing the battle. You know, it's a hard-fought battle by both sides. But, you know, they didn't really want to fight each other in the first place. You know, they both had their reasons for fighting and their differences that they just couldn't set aside. You know, Anakin says, like, I hate you. And he's kind of like burning like the hot lava. And like, I think it's like this volcano or whatever. And Obi-Wan is saying like, hey, I'm sorry for it all. You know, I'm sorry for everything. I'm sorry I had to be this way. Fast forward, there's this quote. I don't remember who said it. I don't know if it was to Anakin or after Anakin got burnt and then he became Darth Vader. But he said, you know, there was never a dragon. There was never a dragon, and there was only you. There was never a dragon, and there never was. It was only you. You know, I think this dragon is so relevant to everyone's life. This metaphorical dragon is like the enemy for Anakin. You know, he thinks that he has to do what he has to do. You know, he slaughtered all those kids in the kind of like that council meeting area. Yeah. And that to him was his dragon. That to him was like his destiny, that he had to do that because everyone else was conspiring against him. And, you know, I don't know about a lot of other people. I definitely can, you know, relate to this quite a lot, where I think, or I believe that this dragon was like the enemy. This dragon was a lot of different people. You know, this dragon was, you know, this girl. This dragon was, you know, your own family, your own parents, you know, whatever it is. You know, for me, it was all of that I just mentioned. It was a girl. It was, you know, family. It was the parents. It was everything. Really, it was never any of that. There was never a dragon. It was never about me and the dragon. You know, once I fight off this dragon, then I'll be good. Once I fight off this dragon, then I'll be content with who I am and where I'm at. Once I fight off this dragon, then my purpose will be fulfilled. And truth be told, you tend not to get any closure when you are thinking like that. You know, I think a lot of it is because, you know, I don't know what the spiritual powers are doing. You know, I kind of believe in like the spiritual realm, but they tend not to let you get any closure, you know, because they constantly want you to fight this sort of like imaginary dragon, imagined dragon. And when you're fighting off this imagined dragon, metaphorical dragon, if you will, you tend not to fight the bigger battle, because the bigger battle really does lie within. You know, I think this is why you see a lot of MMA fighters who tend not to be very content with where they're at once they get out of the fight game. It's just never enough. You know, like John Jones, for example, you know, he had an amazing career, but man, he was so focused on fighting this metaphorical dragon that, you know, he ended up, you know, divulging down into hurting others around him and really missing out on the bigger picture. And, you know, I think this is why the gym community tends to be a lot bigger than the MMA community, you know, because the MMA community, you're constantly fighting this metaphorical dragon. I think the gym community is that kind of realization that there is no dragon and there never was, and it was only you. You know, I think a lot of us have been down that road. Not throwing any shade towards John Jones, but just purely using him as an example. You know, like for me, I went down that road of, hey, I'm gonna work out and I'm gonna show them like what they miss. I'm gonna show them what's up. You know, not only to certain, well, you know, like ladies, but also to my family. You know, but it never was about you know, proving something to them, or it never should have been. You know, because really the battle and the struggle came from within. You know, I know a lot of people deal with this. They deal with you know, the trouble of forgiving others, trouble in making amends with whoever wronged them or whoever they believe that wronged them. You know, maybe it's actually, you know, just cooped up in their head. Maybe it's not real. But regardless if you believe it's real or not, I think you really do have to find it in your heart to find forgiveness. So then you can fight the bigger battle, which is within, which is yourself, which is your own fleshly desires. Kind of get into the Bible now. You know, I've heard of some people say and mention about how bad like their family dynamic really is. I've heard some people see on YouTube about how their family genuinely doesn't like them, genuinely doesn't support them in any way, shape, or form. And, you know, truth be told, I don't know the whole story behind that, but I do know that, you know, it's a very hard thing to forgive them after that. I definitely know it was hard to forgive certain parts of my family, you know, but man, time tells. Let me tell you, time told. You know, there's something about having a higher purpose than the people around you. You know, I don't know, like you definitely could connect this biblically. You know, I probably would, but there's something about just having this higher power, not only like forgiving others, but also being and pursuing down that path of, hey, I'm gonna pursue something bigger than you. I'm gonna pursue something bigger than, you know, everyone. I'm gonna pursue something bigger than everything around me. You know, I'm gonna conquer the battle from within. You know, not so much in a selfish way where it's like, hey, you know, like look what you missed out on. I'm not focused on you anymore. You know, and like kind of making them jealous in that way. Because, you know, I think truth be told, because then you're still fighting that battle. You're still fighting that imaginary dragon, metaphorical dragon, whatever you want to call it. You know, you're still fighting this dragon. Really, there never was any dragon. It was only you. All right, that's all I gotta say. God bless.